who owns the decisions, who owns the savings, who owns the cost, and how do we be fair about where this stuff is really coming from?
Yes, I think there's going to be a constant quest for tangible proof points that I feel like we're in maybe the first or second inning of a long game.
Yeah, I agree.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Decision Intelligence podcast for the year 2026. Happy New Year to all of our loyal listeners, and thanks for sticking with us. This time, we're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than have a guest on, Mike and I are going to spend some time reflecting on our first year of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast, thinking about some of the bigger lessons that we learned, some of the themes that emerged, and maybe say a little bit about where we think this is going in the future. There's a lot going on in the field of decision intelligence, and we're struggling to keep up with all of it and to share as much as we can with you. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Michael Watson, to get us started. Mike, you have the floor.
All right, Vijay. Well, I'm going to turn it right back to you and tell the listeners the story of how this podcast came about and sort of what your interests were in it.
Well, it really started as I was about to become an empty nester. My daughter was going off to college in 2022, and I thought I should start a podcast. And at that time, I'd been really, really interested in the information value chain because I felt like all the years of studying optimization and teaching optimization, the challenges that were out there seemed to transcend our algorithms and our models, and they seemed to involve data and people and process and change management and all kinds of things that were not being taught in school, certainly to our technical students. And so I reached out to folks in the optimization industry, and Gurobi Optimization was kind enough to offer us a sponsorship. And then a whole bunch of things happened. My eyes started to fail. I had surgery on both eyes. I almost became a college president, and I found myself suffering from burnout. Also, I'm an extrovert, and any project that needs to get started by me, by myself, is always going to get pushed to the side. Our good friend, Lindsay Montanari from Gurobi, saw me struggling and said, "Hey, we really want to get this podcast going. Maybe a partner in crime would be good for you." And she was kind enough to introduce me to Michael Watson. And Mike and I hit it off right away. We found our backgrounds were quite similar, and we both had a lot of curiosity about these things. And the first thing Mike said to me was, "Hey, let's not take any sponsorship money. Let's broaden the scope of what we're doing so that we're not just an optimization show. There's so much going on with Gen AI." And,
so now you're getting me in trouble with Lindsay. So all right, we'll have to
Lindsay,
solve that
we
problem.
love you and we haven't forgotten you. So Mike, I'm curious, once you got a call from me, what your interest was in getting involved in a podcast project like this one.
Yeah, so it was kind of out of the blue. Lindsay's like, "Hey, do you want to do this podcast?" This guy named Vijay. I'm like, "I'll be happy to meet him, happy to talk to anyone." I've always loved podcasts. I think they're this great format for getting information you wouldn't otherwise get. Just looking back on our 19 guests, it's like they said things, I think, on our podcast that they probably haven't written or talked about in other venues. And it's just nice to get some of this stuff out in public. And I certainly enjoy interviews. And so I was keen on the podcast. And I just recently started kind of my second career at Northwestern. So I spent my first career doing startups and analytics and supply chain and using AI, machine learning, optimization to solve problems. And I think this was kind of a transition. Like, how can I share this knowledge or, figure out what I learned and then kind of pass that on? And this podcast was like another mechanism for that. So I've always liked blogging and I've always enjoyed listening to podcasts. I thought, well, I should contribute back to the podcast world.
And on that note, all of you, the show notes will include a link to Mike's blog. If you're not following Mike Talks AI, you absolutely should be. So Mike, we standardized on decision intelligence, the Decision Intelligence Lab in our podcast. And our last guest, our last published episode was with Lorian Pratt, who has written a book called The Decision Intelligence Handbook and really has been a cheerleader and an advocate and a kind of an originator and a leader in the space of decision intelligence. What did you take away from our conversation with Lorian that you think is worth kind of mentioning in our retrospective here?
Yeah, I think, what I liked about her point, and then I think several other guests kind of hit this same thing, is sort of, I think they gave the podcast a theme of like, how do you make these big decisions over time. And it's something that I'm wrestling with. I've wrestled with is like, all right, what decisions do we make? How do organizations make these decisions? How do we teach people frameworks for making these kind of decisions? And I think she did a nice job of she has a nice framework of how to think about decision intelligence. I think Zohar had another one too, like, making sure you're solving the right meta problem. And even Warren and Adam, when they talked about sequential decisions, I really liked how, they kind of framed it as like a decision that you make is really probably something you're going to have to make a decision you're going to have to make again. So you should think like, what decision do I make today and how might that impact my decisions tomorrow? So I know I answered a little more than you thought. Like, what did you take away from decision intelligence? I know you probably pushed harder than me for the name decision intelligence. So what is it about that struck you?
Well, I think that I wanted to make it clear to the audience in the title that we weren't just talking about optimization. We weren't just talking about operations research. And we weren't just talking about machine learning. But those are all tools and technologies that are used in the business space to drive decisions that are connected to financial and corporate outcomes. And I wanted that to be loud and clear. And um, what's interesting about that is that so much of what's happening now has data streaming in and the opportunity to update our decisions based on new data, to adjust the course that we're on based on new data. And that was, as you said, something that we really got from Adam Jones and Warren Powell. Um, and so that was interesting to me, the idea of the entire value chain and structuring the way that we work based on the decisions and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. That was really kind of why I pushed for the title the
Yeah, yeah.
way that it was. But the laboratory piece I really liked as well in the title, because one of the things that I think we've done a good job of, and I'm super excited to do more of it, is to highlight places where optimization, data science, AI are being applied that are not traditional domains for that. I know I worked for a long time on internet advertising and call centers, traditional domains. You've worked on supply chain, traditional domains. We had a bunch of guests from different places. Did you have a couple of favorites, Mike?
Well, let me riff on something you said. You talked about,
Okay.
the trend of data becoming important. I think we had two interesting things. Lorianne and Ben, who did sports analytics, both had this a similar point on data. And Lorianne's point was like sometimes more data doesn't help. And I really like that because I think it's our inclination in this field is like, let's collect more and more data. How can it be bad? And she's like, actually, like you can be wasting your time collecting the wrong data. It's like it can lead to problems. And then Ben had a different point, which I also thought was cool. And I've seen it a lot in my career, is that especially young analysts sort of get stuck thinking, well, I don't have the data. And he had some problem. Go back and listen to the podcast, but it was basically some problem evaluating a player. They didn't have data on this player in a certain position. And so they had to make the data up and come up with estimates. And I'm like, yeah, this is what we have to do in the real world. We have to make some decisions. Is there some data, put quotes around it, that we have to make up to sort of make some decisions. So I like getting those little tidbits out of some of the podcasts because I think it's lessons that are completely relevant. I can completely bring it to my students, and it's completely relevant to people in industry. It's like, yeah, sometimes more data is not better. Don't invest in that. And sometimes you have to make up data or do something without the data, and it's just not going to come. You're just not going to get it. Like you have to move forward.
Well, I want to riff on that because Ben talked about proxies for assessing Russell Westbrook,
Yeah, yeah,
for which
right.
there was no data because he hadn't been a point guard. John Peterson is working in a whole new space, leading up a data science team for electric vertical takeoff and landing helicopters for mobile commuting by air within urban areas. And this is a brand new technology and a brand new service. So he talked in a great
Mm,
detail about how they had to find proxies for data to just try to ask and answer questions so that they could move forward in their innovations as a new business. And then the other thing that popped out, John a little bit, but Ben and Warren Lieberman in particular. Warren Lieberman talked about optimization and self storage. Ben talked about optimal decisions in professional sports, and both of them pointed out that there are people on the ground that have knowledge that's not captured in our data. And how do we support them while allowing them to leverage what they bring uniquely? And I think Warren talked about um, particular self-service stores, as they call them, that outperform the algorithms simply because the people on the ground had intuition that the algorithm didn't capture in its data. And it wasn't a case of A versus B, but really allowing that decision maker to leverage what the model said and then have autonomy as well.
Yeah, and who else echoed that was I think Filippo echoed that too when he told the story about Toyota, and he made a point that the current planners have this wealth of information, and I think Adam made the same point, a similar point, and I'm sure other guests did too. And it's like, I think that's worth knowing is that as when we come into these problems, we should start from the assumption that the people we're talking to really know what they're doing and figure out what it is they know, and or they know things that just can't be articulated. I think that's an interesting insight as we build these models, is not to ignore that knowledge that's on the ground.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is sometimes we need to kind of shape that a bit. And I'm thinking of Peyton Fry, who, although most of his work is around call centers, he doesn't see himself as a call center person. He sees himself as somebody involved in the delivery of healthcare and the service chain to deliver healthcare. And he really had to he talked a lot about working with leaders to articulate what are the right metrics around which we should be modeling and optimizing. And, it felt like there was a fair amount of education that he had to do to connect patient access with patient outcomes.
Right, and he made
So
a great point. He made a great point that resonated with me, and that was his basic point was like, our dashboards are probably too busy. I love dashboards and analyzing data, and I probably make this mistake a million times because it's just interesting to me. But he had a point like, I think his point was basically like, you should have one metric that you look at. And then he goes, if you convince me to have two, I'll let you have two. But I think that was the right approach. It's like, start with one metric. And if you have to have two or three, go to two or three, but you have to justify the second and third one. I'm putting some words in his mouth, but that's kind of how I see it. And
yes.
I think I've seen that when I do modeling too. So I've done some when I do some, have done network modeling, had to aggregate like products or something for strategic decisions. I always like to say, yeah, I'm starting with one. I'm aggregating everything you make into one big product, and you tell me why I should split it up into two. Sometimes there's good reasons, but I think doing that sort of forces you to keep it small. And I like Peyton hit that point for me pretty well.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of guests working in a lot of different domains, and I learned a lot and have a kind of curiosity about operations in different places that was really fueled by them. Um, so we had a lot of great stories that we learned from Ben, from Peyton, from John Peterson, from Warren Lieberman, but we also paid a lot of attention to project risk and project failure. What um, did you have any big takeaways from Doug Gray? And I want to put a plug in for Doug's book, why, along with Evan Shellshire, Why Data Science Projects Fail. Because
Yeah,
Doug shares some really good insights with us.
he did share some good ones. I'm going to share a couple little ones, like little points that I think really stuck with me from. So Doug Gray, and I forgot who else. Someone else must have said something similar, but they talked. There was a theme that kind of ran through as like, build user interfaces that your customers are used to seeing. And I think, this goes to project failure and risk too. It's like,
Mhm.
if I come up with something totally new as an interface, that just adds one more piece of friction. And if I can keep the same interface but build a cool algorithm, then that gives me permission to roll out that new algorithm with a similar interface. And then later I can make the interface better if I have to. But I thought that was for sure an interesting point. And another theme I saw along these lines was just the importance of testing. Like, especially, coming from where I'm sitting now in academia, it's like when we teach, it's like I don't know, and I'm guilty too. It's like you just only have so much time in the classroom, and teaching testing it to non-computer scientists is, I think not obvious or not an intuitive thing to do. And it's like, yeah, we should make that part of our process to think about how do you actually test these algorithms and these models that you're building.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up testing. Borgia is the one that I think of as who developed Borgia Moreno Menendez, who has a distinction along with Zohar Strinka of being our only two-time guests during our first year.
Two out of
Borgia has built
19. Yeah.
he's built these massive test suites so that before he rolls any kind of optimization model into production, he's confident that he's looked at the edge cases, that he's looked at the kinds of things that are going to be problematic in production. And actually, that was another theme across our podcast was, hey, building models does not equate to successfully implementing models, particularly in real-time production systems. Um, I know Pete Cacioppi is a friend of yours, so I'd love to have you talk about our session with Pete, which I found to be super enlightening.
Yeah, so, the reason one of the big reasons I wanted Pete on the podcast was to get his, tidy, tested, and safe methodology because I think, he's coming at OR from a computer science background, and I think there's a lot to learn there, and, his job basically and it's been his career productionizing, basically these algorithms, that have to run across hundreds of customers and have to run when customers and clients put in any kind of data imaginable, and it can't crash because he knows that he taught me, and I learned this early on in logic tools, is that if something crashes and just crashes, like, that becomes the vendor's problem. If you can tell the user what happened that led to the crash, then you've sort of pushed it back to them to sort of say, I put a negative number here and there shouldn't be negative numbers. Like, oh, okay, now I can fix that problem. So his tidy, tested, and safe is a way to do
Safe.
that. Is thinking of like, all right, how do I make these models so that they're robust and they can handle all kinds of data, and there's a lot of data checks on the front end, and then I'm doing the normal computer science testing, and then I'm also delivering to people like I'm delivering to other people on the team. I can't remember if it's well, now I'm getting confused exactly with the model, but I'm delivering to the developers like a small little app that they can just
Yes.
interface with and put it into the larger system. And I think that is also a good insight.
Yeah, I would never want Peter to look at my code, which is the opposite of tidy. And so
Mhm.
I was, I, I think he brought and he and Borja both brought a certain amount of computer science rigor to how they think about building out and deploying models. And I think that was really amped by Carolyn Mooney, who's, the CEO of a startup that's focused on what the company's called Next Move, and they're focused on decision ops, which is the parallel to machine learning ops. How do we build models, move them into production in a way that fits in with our continuous improvement, continuous testing, CI/CD
Right.
environments? Uh, I learned a
Yeah.
ton from Carolyn's session.
Yeah. What were some of your big takeaways from her? Like what? Because
Well, I think the big takeaway for me is that there are only so many Pete's and Borges out there who are going to be able to build specific test suites and build the code and the infrastructure around them. And that what I think Next Move is doing, what's interesting, is trying to productize that. And they've talked, and I can't remember if she mentioned the podcast or in our prep session around this, but they talked about the same way that messaging software vendors have kind of created tools in order to make an average or a normal non-specialized software engineer into a messaging engineer. That she's got the same goals and hopes for software developers building real-time production systems, making them much more capable with optimization by giving them tools that fit into their framework and their environment. So yeah, it was, and interestingly, my conversations with Carolyn years ago are really some of the things that had sparked the idea for the podcast in the first place. So it was super fun to have her on and see kind of how they've come along.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, yeah. As you think back to the other theme we talked about when we were prepping for this is you like the idea of kind of this value chain, the value chain of decisions. And, I think obviously Carolyn talked a little bit about that, but there was a few other guests who talked about that too. You want to comment on sort of what you enjoyed about that?
Yeah, I think that the two that jumped to mind, which I just mentioned a minute ago, Borja and Zohar. Borja Moreno Mendez has got a real passion for bringing successful mindset around data science and optimization to as broad a community as you can. And there will be in the show notes a link to Borges' Feasible blog, which I think anybody that enjoys our podcast will enjoy his blog as well. So he had sort of rolled out a story about the information value chain as a project
Right.
this December, what he called the advent of operations research. And each day there would be another nugget uh, about different parts of the value chain. But what I liked about it was he started with the business problem. He didn't start with the algorithm. He didn't start with the data. He started with a business problem and kind of talked about how do we refine our understanding of that. And then how do we then model and deploy and gather feedback around that So Borgia was one, and
So
Zohar.
let me just stop you
Yeah.
there because I've got an
Yes.
interesting a little side note on that. So the advent of OR, so he did this 24 days, and so it got the notice randomly without me saying something of a colleague of mine at Northwestern, Jill Wilson, and she saw his post on LinkedIn the first day, and then what she also noticed was that there was this wealth of great comments on LinkedIn with other ideas and other tips from sort of the basically crowdsourcing. And so I've got a secret project on the side. I asked Borgia about it. He said, "Yeah, I'm not doing it." So I found someone that could help me, and we scraped all the comments on the LinkedIn posts. And so we have all these comments from all over, hundreds of people. It's like 500 pages of a Google Doc of just like copy and paste. And so we're gonna hopefully turn that into a book. So I'm saying it publicly, so it not a book, but something
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
digestible. And so I'm saying it publicly to sort of make it happen. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Like this was it was a fantastic project that he did, and it's like, oh, we can't lose all those comments. Like those comments are some of them are gold.
Yeah, and the fact that A, we're able to scrape them, which we've known how to do for a long time, but B, now how we're able to shape and organize that information using Gen AI is sort of phenomenal.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping is that we can sort of summarize that and turn it into educational packages or just do something interesting to say, like, these people have interesting things to say about how you should run a project. I've noticed that on my own LinkedIn posts. Like occasionally I'll just get some super insightful like comments and it's like, oh, I don't want to lose this comment. Like these comments should be somehow saved and
Yes.
referenced and searchable or something. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted your value chain.
No, no, no. On the contrary, what I would kind of jump on that and say is that there's definitely I've seen a lot of communication, both one on one to me and posts that say, "Hey, all these artifacts, all these old directories that we've kept around with personal notes and writing and memos and project documents, suddenly those things can generate value as a result of being able to feed them to Gen AI platforms
Yeah.
and have them summarize and slice and dice. And so, what you're doing with those comments around the advent of OR, I think, is super exciting now in a way that 5 years ago we've been, yeah, we got to get a grad student to look at that, and it probably never happened. Now we've got this grad
Right.
student machine called Gen AI that can
Right. Yeah,
we can
yeah.
put to work.
It just gets a lot easier. It gets a lot easier.
I do, but I want to come back to Gen AI. Let me just say two quick words on the value chain, and then I want to throw it back over to you.
Okay.
And that is shout out to both Zohar, who was part of the committee, the Informs committee that put together the Informs analytics framework. And she came on with Borgia and explained that really nicely. And I think it's really valuable for everybody that's being trained in statistics, industrial engineering, operations research to kind of have that mindset and that analytical framework around how do these things actually work in practice. So it's thrilling, great to have her on. And then Zahir Bolaporia, um, uh, he really has been writing about this for years. And I was happy to have him on talking about the politics of data science and how you can do 10 things right, but that last step of making sure that, hey, people are bought in, and using the technology and understanding what they're using, understanding when to override it. All of that is stuff that he learned again in non-traditional space in the trucking industry, and he brought a lot of great insights about that to to the podcast episode that he was on. That really helped me remember that you are only as good as your weakest link in the value chain.
Yeah, right. I liked how he was I think he told some stories of him hopping in a truck and driving around with the driver, and I think it's the right way to do it. And Carolyn mentioned something too, like make sure your engineers sit right next to the business users. It's a good theme that came across with a lot of guests, I think.
I want to throw it over to you, Mike, because you had two guys that you know well and have worked with, Harley Davis and Ganesh Ramakrishna, that are working on very innovative things that involve traditional data science, analytics, OR, as well as Gen AI. Um, what do you remember about those episodes as your real key takeaways?
Yeah, so I worked with Harley when I was back at I was at a company called Logic Tools, which was a supply chain company. It was acquired by iLog, which is Cplex at the time, and they had a business rules division, and Harley was part of that. And I ended up working for Harley, so he was my boss. And then we got bought by IBM, and and then he recently spun off and did his own. Doing his own startup, And what I really liked about him and what I bring to when I teach about AI and talk to executives about AI, I use lessons I learned from Harley. And he's like, if you take the best of what LLMs do and combine it with other technologies, he was thinking of like business rules, which are, think of this as sophisticated if then. It's a lot more than that, but it's
Yep.
like that or optimization. And these two work together, you're going to get a much better solution. You're going to get a much more trustworthy and robust solution. And I think that was a huge lesson that I pulled from that episode. And then I've worked with Ganesh a long time, so we co-founded OpEx Analytics, which did machine learning plus optimization. So I wanted to get him on to talk about Lyric. So he talked about two things. He talked about just VC. Like I wanted him to talk about what it's like to raise money. I think a lot of people in this community think about startups, and I just wanted his perspective. So his company is going for VC money. They've raised a lot. I can't remember what the public number is, 66 million or something, like a very large number. And and he was pretty honest and talking about sort of what came with that. Like it's not just free money. Like there's a lot of work and a lot of
Yes.
pressure when you're playing that game. So I thought that was interesting from that. And then he also talked about his company Lyric, and what they're doing is like taking supply chain and giving solving supply chain problems, but giving companies the ability to sort of plug in their own algorithms. So like a lot of the episodes we talked about, like how do you build these algorithms? His company Lyric is sort of helping figure out like, all right, so how do you get these algorithms, built? How do you get them deployed? So that with a user interface that your users will like. And I think, when I've heard Ganesh speak publicly, like, he's got a kind of an algorithm first or math first approach and saying like, we should think about things differently now. We have this ability to build all these algorithms that are tailored to our business. Like, let's do that. And let's ramp up our business and not worry about some generic algorithm that solves any problem. Let's solve our problem.
Yeah, I think I got some of the same themes from Filippo around, hey, how can we what they're
Yes, for sure.
doing is, building a platform so that you don't have to be an OR specialist to build a complex optimization solution. Um, and also exploring kind of, hey, how does the tech stack look different today? How does it look different a year from now? And uh, I think that's going to be one of our big themes uh, in 2026 is so much is happening with generative AI and its potential uses for um, preparing data for machine learning or for optimization, for interpreting results from machine learning and optimization. I think that there's a huge change afoot as a result of Gen AI's capabilities, and I'm excited to explore that with some of the guests we have coming up. Any other things, Mike, as we turn to 2026 that you've been thinking about, that you're excited about, what's going on in our space?
Yeah, I'm like you. Like one of my projects is a class that starts on April 1st on basically how managers should think about AI, and I've got a few talks between now and then. And so I'm just curious to keep diving into this space. Like I teach this class every year, and it's don't sign up to teach a class like this. It's bad. It's bad for your career and your mental health because the space changes like every year that you really have to redo the whole thing every year. So it's like a new class every year. But in that sense, it's also kind of fun to listen to, like, what are people saying and sort of how should managers think about this tool and how should they think about the whole space? And, I, I look forward to sort of digging into that. We had a guest, was it Karthik,
Yes,
who was
about
talking
how
about like fast
ra-
technology change. And like, I think he was right. Like, at some point it seems like no change, no change, no change. And then all of a sudden, like it's not sustainable anymore. And like, you just have to use this technology. And maybe LLMs are kind of like that, or maybe LLMs plus all this other technology we heard about is helpful. Like, I like that we had guests that were sort of, I don't think we weren't all in on LLMs for sure. Like this podcast was what I liked was it was like, I think pretty practical. And I think we had some guests who were probably like, I think LLMs aren't going to be all that, there's just going to be another tool. And I think that's a healthy way to kind of think about this as we figure out like how all these tools fit together and what exactly will these LLMs do.
Yeah, and I think on that note, there's so much talk about agentic AI, leveraging LLMs and agents being, I think, able to move more quickly, more decisively, and potentially more intelligently than humans. and yet you can't fire the AI. And so one of the themes that I'm really interested in for the next year is around agentic AI and the questions of security and trust, and
Mhm.
how do we manage and monitor their processes and operations, and with controls and shut off valves and all the things that help us sleep at night. And to your point, figuring out how do we teach people to
Yeah.
take on those kinds of roles going forward. That's a hot button with me for sure. Agents and trust.
It's interesting. You might wanna check out there's a podcast I'm halfway through, Andre Karpathy, and he's on the Dwarkesh podcast. So Andre is he's like super famous, LLM researcher, worked at OpenAI, worked at Tesla doing self-driving, worked with Hinton so
Yes.
he, like, knows his stuff, and he's
Yes.
very good at explaining this. And I think he actually he's not going on the hype side. He said, "Oh, there's a lot of people saying 2026 is a year of agents." He says, "I think 2026 is the decade of agents in the sense that he thinks we're a lot further away." Because if you look at LLMs, he made I think an interesting point. It's like you look at what they're really smart at and what they're missing. It's like they're missing chunks of the brain, like a human brain. Like, because you can't quite give them the same task you
Yes.
would give a human because they're for sure missing big parts of what a human brain does. I mean, they have other parts that they nail, and so I think it's gonna be interesting to watch and see how this unfolds. Like, for sure, vendors might be trying to hype it up to
Oh
say
yeah.
like invest money in us and so on. And I think he's an outsider insider outsider. Like he doesn't have anything to gain, I don't think, financially from any of these, and he's kind of saying, "Yeah, it's gonna take some time."
Yeah, and on that note, kind of my last theme that I'm really kind of watching and curious about in 2026 is who owns the decision processes and how are they
Mm,
evaluated? Because things seem so fragmented across organizations. I think that was a theme that we got from Doug and Irv Lustig around failures was things that get orphaned. And when things go well, everybody wants credit. And when things don't go well, nobody wants the blame. They're always pointing somewhere else. And I can only imagine that that gets more intense as our tech stack gets more complicated, as agents have more autonomy, as more stuff gets automated. So it's
So
a
I was I
really
was
interesting time.
I I was a grad
Yeah.
student. I was a grad student intern at this factory at General Motors, and there was this great like assistant plant manager. He'd be a super experienced guy. It was a big factory, thousands of employees, so pretty high level guy. And we were in a room once, and someone was talking about savings, and it was a small enough group. He basically like let a big sigh out, and he's like, if I add up all the savings that everyone claims that they're giving me, it adds up to 10 times what my budget is every year. And I thought that was something that kept with me in my mind is this like, like an anti BS thing. It's like, don't overestimate that. And I think you kind of hit on that. Like who owns the decisions, who owns the savings, who owns the cost, and how do we be fair about like, where this stuff is really coming from?
But here's what we do know. Our jobs get more interesting and they get more harder. They more difficult
Yeah.
as the technology kind of advances. Making sense of that, staying on top of that. I'm excited for your new class and hoping to steal some of that material for my new class next fall for MBAs. That question of what do managers need to know, and one of the things I hear over and over and over again is executives are screaming for AI. We need AI. We need AI, and they're not often not sure what they're asking for or what they're trying to accomplish. They just want to be able to go to the board meeting and say, "Hey, we're using AI. Trust us on this."
Right.
So I think there's going to be a constant quest for tangible proof points that I feel like we're in the maybe the first or second inning of a long game.
Yeah, I agree. So let's wrap up with we had a lot of guests in the first season who are also going to write a chapter for your book. Um, so why don't why don't you
Yes.
in this episode with talking about like what you hope your book's going to do and when we can expect to see it.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yes, I've been working on this book off and on for many years, but really now have to finish it this year for my own psyche. The book's title is Capturing Business Value from Decision Intelligence Technologies. And the punchline, the kind of meta theme of the book is the technology doesn't capture the value. The organization and the human beings
Mm,
involved are critical to capturing the value at every step along the way. And so the book is a collection of essays starting from what is decision intelligence and what kind of impact can it have, continuing on how do we design and develop projects or products for decision intelligence. How do we deploy them effectively? How do we manage them over time? And how does a little peek into how does the agentic
Okay.
revolution that's just starting out impact all of that? And the punchline and the underlying theme is it's all about the people at every step along the way, and our ability to understand one another, to trust one another is crucial to success and collaboration.
Oh,
And,
sounds like a
kind
perfect
of,
companion for this podcast, right?
yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what we heard from Lorianne and from a lot of our guests around how important is trust, how important is connection and collaboration. Even as our AI tools get more and more sophisticated, I think the importance of trust and the people issues is only going to get bigger.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. You said something about you we need to get this book done this year to get it off your mind. I was listening to another podcast of, pretty somewhat famous academic guy, and he said a lot of people come to him and said, "Should you do a book?" And his standard answer is like, "Don't do a book. Don't write a book unless you really have some itch that you have to scratch and you have to do it. Otherwise, don't do it." And I think, you with the look in your eyes, you
Yeah,
sort of you gave credence to that, advice that
yeah,
it
absolutely. And a friend of mine who's written 3 books told me the same thing up front. Uh,
Yeah.
and I do feel in some ways that this is kind of the end of my, a culminating point in my intellectual journey from having started out studying very narrow technical things, then having gone out in the world and found that the things that were the most valuable were the things that engendered trust and collaboration, with some data and some models supporting all of that.
Perfect.
And really trying to tell that story is something that I really enjoyed doing on the podcast, and really we're trying hard to do in the book as well. It will be finished in 2026, guaranteed.
Alright, well, let's end this podcast on that. Thanks, VJ, for, sharing everything today.
And thanks, Mike, for partnering with the podcast, partnering on the podcast with me, and thanks to our audience for making us one of the top 25 podcasts worldwide in just our first year. Uh, if you
Top
like the
25%, top
podcast,
25%.
25%. That's
And
right. That's
there's a
right.
long tail, but top 25%.
An extraordinarily long tail that we're on the at least the top part of. Please share the podcast with your friends, with your colleagues, with your classmates, and send us suggestions. And if you'd like to be on the podcast or want to nominate someone to be on the podcast, just send us a note at decisionintelligencepodcast@gmail.com. And subscribe. Mike, you've got the subscribe URL at Substack.
Yes, I do, but
Is it,
now for
is it
Decision Intelligence Lab,
doesn't
Substack at Decision Intelligence Lab. You can find it on my podcast. We'll put it in the show
uh,
notes. Sorry, you
excellent.
got me off guard.
Thanks, everybody. No
Yep,
worries, and
thanks.
Happy New Year. Here's to
Alright.
another great year. See
Yep,
you soon.
thanks, VJ.